The divorce papers landed on my breakfast table with a theatrical flourish, right next to the wilted carnations David had picked up from the gas station. Mother's Day, 2020. Happy Mother's Day, Elena, David said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy as he adjusted his expensive watch. The one I'd bought him for our anniversary last year. I figured it was time to make this official. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at the legal documents, my coffee growing cold as I processed the carefully typed words that would dissolve our 7-year marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd chosen today, of all days, to serve me papers. But then again, David had always had a flair for the dramatic. The timing seems a bit cruel, don't you think? I said softly, not looking up from the papers. My voice remained steady despite the storm brewing inside me. David shrugged, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. Cruel, Lena. You trapped me into this marriage with that pregnancy scare 7 years ago. I think I've been more than patient. There it was. The narrative he'd been spinning to his friends for months, thinking I didn't know. The story of how his naive girlfriend had accidentally gotten pregnant, forcing him into a hasty marriage that never actually produced a child. How he'd been the victim of manipulation, stuck with a woman who couldn't even give him the family she'd promised. What David didn't know, what none of his smug friends knew, was that there had never been a pregnancy scare. There had been something far more valuable, information. 7 years ago, fresh out of law school and working at a mid-tier firm, I'd discovered something about David's family business that would have destroyed them. Instead of exposing it, I'd made a different choice. A choice that had protected his family's empire while positioning myself exactly where I needed to be. I see, I murmured, finally looking up at him. David was preening in the mirror, probably anticipating his triumphant return to bachelorhood. At 34, he still thought he was God's gift to women, with his perfectly styled hair and gym-sculpted physique. And what exactly am I supposed to have trapped you with? He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of superiority and impatience. Oh please, the whole, I'm pregnant drama right before graduation. The sudden wedding plans, the convenient miscarriage a month later. He made air quotes around the word miscarriage, and something cold settled in my chest. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stood slowly, smoothing my silk robe, the one he'd bought me for Christmas, probably with his secretary's help. That's quite a story, David. Have you been sharing it with your friends? They deserve to know the truth, he said, checking his reflection one more time. Marcus, Tony, Jake, they all thought I was crazy for marrying so young. They were right. Marcus Delacroix, son of a federal judge. Tony Brennan, whose family owned half the construction contracts in the city. Jake Morrison, whose father sat on the board of 3 major banks. David's inner circle of entitled trust fund babies, who'd never worked a real day in their lives but wielded tremendous influence through their family connections. I'm sure they did, I said, picking up the divorce papers and scanning them more carefully. David's lawyer had done thorough work, or so it appeared. The division of assets was heavily skewed in his favor, with my share of our jointly acquired wealth being laughably small. He probably thought I'd be so devastated by the timing and public humiliation that I'd sign without reading the fine print. My lawyer says this should be pretty straightforward. David continued, clearly enjoying what he thought was my stunned silence. No kids, limited shared assets. You can keep your little law practice, of course. My little law practice. The boutique firm I'd built from nothing, specializing in corporate law and private investigations. The business that had quietly grown into one of the most respected and discreet firms in the city. David had always dismissed it as a hobby, something to keep me busy while he climbed the corporate ladder in his family's real estate empire. How generous, I said, setting the papers aside. And what about the house? Obviously I'll be keeping it. It was purchased primarily with family money. He straightened his jacket, preparing for whatever important meeting he had scheduled for Mother's Day morning. Probably brunch with his mother and sister, where he'd spin his tale of liberation from his manipulative wife. The house, our beautiful colonial in Beacon Hill, with its perfectly manicured garden and marble kitchen counters. The house that was indeed purchased with family money, but not his family's money. The down payment had come from a very specific account, one that David had never bothered to trace back to its source. "I should get going," he said, grabbing his keys from the silver bowl by the door. "The papers are pretty self-explanatory, but if you have questions, your lawyer can call mine. I'm sure we can have this wrapped up quickly." "David," I called as he reached for the door handle. He turned back, his expression already showing the first hints of freedom he thought he'd achieved. "Yes? You mentioned telling your friends about how I trapped you. Have you been specific about the details?" He shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering if I was about to become emotional or difficult. "They know what they need to know. About the pregnancy lie, the rushed marriage, all of it." I nodded slowly, committing his words to memory. "And they believed you, that I would be that calculating. Alina, honey," he said, his voice taking on that condescending tone he used when he thought he was being kind. "You're a lawyer. Of course you're calculating. It's what you do." With that final insult he left, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble foyer as the door closed behind him with a definitive click. I remained standing in our kitchen, soon to be his kitchen, listening to his car start and pull out of the driveway. Only then did I allow myself to smile. David had made so many assumptions. He assumed I'd been devastated by his revelations to his friends. He assumed I'd meekly accept his divorce term. Most critically, he assumed I'd been sitting passively in our marriage, playing the role of the supportive wife while he built his empire. What he didn't know was that I'd been building something far more substantial than a real estate portfolio. For 7 years I'd been collecting information. Every business dinner where his friends had bragged about their questionable deals, every charity gala where their wives had gossiped about family secrets, every private moment where David had shared confidential information about his own family's less than legal activity. I walked to my home office, a room David rarely entered, dismissing it as my little legal corner. The built-in shelves were lined with law books and case files, but behind the false panel I'd had installed 3 years ago was my real work. 7 years of carefully documented evidence of corruption, tax evasion, and fraud involving some of the city's most powerful family. The Delacroix family's judicial influence peddling scheme, the Brennan construction bid rigging operation, the Morrison banking irregularities that would make the front page of every financial newspaper in the country. And of course, David's own family business, the real estate empire built on money laundering and zoning law violations, that would collapse like a house of cards if the right authorities received the right information. I'd never intended to use any of. My plan had been to maintain the perfect balance, staying close enough to monitor their activities, protected by marriage and social connections, while building my own legitimate legal practice, a quiet life of careful observation and strategic positioning. But David had changed the rules of the game when he decided to rewrite our history, when he chose to paint me as a manipulative woman who had trapped him with lies, when he picked Mother's Day to serve me divorce papers like some kind of twisted gift. I pulled out my secure phone, the one David didn't know existed, and scrolled through my contacts. 7 years of networking had given me relationships he couldn't imagine. Journalists who specialized in corruption exposés, federal investigators who'd been building cases against exactly the types of operations David's friends ran, prosecutors who would salivate over the evidence I'd collected. But first I needed to make some calls to prepare the battlefield. "Sarah," I said when my assistant answered on the first ring. Sarah Martinez had been with my firm for 3 years, a brilliant paralegal whose background in forensic accounting made her invaluable for the complex cases we handled. She was also one of the few people who knew the true scope of my extracurricular research. "Alina, happy Mother's Day. How are the flowers David picked up?" I smiled despite everything. Sarah had been tracking David's credit card purchases as part of our standard security monitoring. "Gas station carnations. Very romantic." "Oh no. What did he do?" "He served me divorce papers this morning right next to the flowers." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds before Sarah's voice returned, sharp with focus. "What do you need?" "I need you to start preparing the Morrison files, all of them, and I need a meeting with Detective Rodriguez for tomorrow morning." Detective Carmen Rodriguez was my contact in the Financial Crimes Division. Someone I'd worked with on several white-collar cases. She'd been building a case against banking irregularities for 2 years, always just missing the key evidence she needed to make it stick. The Morrison files, Sarah repeated, and I could hear her already moving toward her computer. Are we talking about just Jake or the whole family? The whole family, every transaction, every document, every recorded conversation from the charity gala. David was kind enough to inform me this morning that his friends deserve to know the truth. I think it's time they learned what truth really looks like. What about the Delacroix and Brennan materials? I considered this carefully. The beauty of having comprehensive evidence on multiple families was that I could release it strategically, creating maximum impact while protecting myself from retaliation. If I moved against all of them simultaneously, it might look like a revenge plot. But if I started with one family and let the investigation naturally expand, start with Morrison, but have everything else ready to go, I have a feeling this is going to move quickly once it starts. Alina, Sarah said, her voice cautious, are you sure about this? Once we open this door, there's no closing it. David and his friends, they have a lot of power. I looked around my home office, thinking about the woman David thought he'd married versus the woman I actually was. He'd never bothered to really know me, never questioned why a promising law school graduate would be content to play the supportive wife role. He'd accepted my quiet presence in his life without ever wondering what I was quietly observing. Sarah, do you know what David told his friends about our marriage? I can guess. He told them I trapped him with a fake pregnancy, that I manipulated him into marrying me and then conveniently lost the baby a month later. I let that sink. He's been telling people that I'm a liar and a manipulator who couldn't even manage to actually get pregnant. That bastard. What he doesn't realize is that he's absolutely right about one thing. I am calculating. I have been manipulating the situation, but not in the way he thinks. I pulled out the Morrison file, thick with years of accumulated evidence. I didn't trap him with a pregnancy, Sarah. I trapped him with something much more valuable. I smiled, thinking about David's confident walk out the door, his assumption that he held all the cards in our divorce, information, and now he's given me the perfect reason to use it. After I hung up with Sarah, I spent the rest of Mother's Day morning reviewing my files and planning my strategy. The key to bringing down a network of corruption wasn't to hit it all at once. It was to find the weakest link and apply pressure until the whole chain snapped. Jake Morrison was definitely the weakest link. Unlike Marcus, whose father's judicial position provided some protection, or Tony, whose family's construction business was deeply embedded in legitimate city infrastructure, Jake's banking connections were purely based on his father's board positions that could be revoked quickly if the right evidence surfaced. Moreover, Jake was the most reckless of David's friends. He was the one who bragged about insider trading at dinner parties, the one who couldn't resist name-dropping about confidential deals, the one who'd made the most recorded admissions of illegal activity over the years. My phone rang, interrupting my strategic planning. David's name appeared on the screen and I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. Hello, Dave. Alina, I just wanted to check. You're not planning to make this difficult, are you? The divorce, I mean. I could hear voices in the background, the clink of glasses. He was already celebrating with his family, probably regaling them with stories of his liberation from his manipulative wife. Difficult how exactly? You know what I mean. Contesting the terms, dragging it out in court, trying to claim half of everything. The prenup is pretty clear about asset division. The prenup, another document David thought protected him, without ever examining its true implication. I remember the prenup, David. Very thorough. Good. I'm glad we can handle this like adults. Of course, although I do have one question. What's that? When you've been telling your friends about how I trapped you, have you mentioned the prenup, how it was structured? What does that matter? I'm just curious about how detailed your stories have been, whether you've explained to Marcus and Tony and Jake exactly how our assets were divided from the beginning. Alina, what are you getting at? I smiled, imagining his family around him, probably wondering why his expression was changing. Nothing important, just making sure I understand the full scope of what you've shared with people. I've told them the truth, that you manipulated me into marriage and now you're trying to manipulate the divorce. Am I trying to manipulate the divorce? aren't you? I considered this question seriously. Was I manipulating the divorce, or was I simply finally playing the game David had started 7 years ago when he chose to marry me for reasons he'd never fully understood? David, I think you'll find that I'm exactly as calculating as you've always said I was. The only difference is that now I don't have any reason to hide it. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. What does that mean? He finally asked. It means, I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked our perfectly manicured garden, that you should probably call your lawyer, and maybe suggest that your friends call theirs too. I hung up before he could respond, then immediately powered down my regular phone and picked up my secure device. Time to make the calls that would set everything in motion. The first call went to Detective Rodriguez. Carmen, it's Elena Santos. I need to schedule a meeting for tomorrow morning. I have some information about the Morrison banking case you've been working on. What kind of information? The kind that's going to make your career. The second call went to Jennifer Walsh, the investigative journalist at the Globe who'd been sniffing around municipal corruption for months. Jennifer, Elena Santos, remember that conversation we had about needing sources inside the banking community? I think I might be able to help you with that. The third call was the most important one. Michael Torres, the federal prosecutor who'd been building RICO cases against organized money laundering operations. We'd worked together on 2 previous cases, and I knew he'd been frustrated by his inability to penetrate the social networks where the real crimes were planned. Michael, it's Elena. I hope you're sitting down because I'm about to make your deck. By the time David returned home that evening, I'd spent the day setting up meetings, organizing evidence, and preparing for what would either be the most spectacular implosion of a social network in the city's history, or my own professional suicide. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner as if nothing had changed, when I heard his key in the door. Elena, he called out, his voice carrying an uncertainty that hadn't been there that morning. In here, I replied, continuing to chop vegetables for the salad. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing his expensive suit but looking somehow diminished. We need to talk. Of course. Did you have a nice Mother's Day with your family? Elena, what did you mean on the phone, about me calling my lawyer and my friends calling theirs? I set down my knife and turned to face him fully. For 7 years I'd looked at David and seen my husband, sometimes loving, sometimes frustrating, but always familiar. Now I looked at him, and saw something entirely different, an opponent who'd made the critical error of underestimating me. David, you served me divorce papers this morning, and told me that you've been sharing our private business with your friends. You've painted me as a manipulative liar who trapped you into marriage. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for that? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you've spent 7 years bringing me to business dinners, charity galas, and private parties where your friends discuss things they probably shouldn't discuss in front of a lawyer they've decided to dismiss as harmless. His face paled slightly. Elena, you can't. Attorney-client privilege doesn't apply when I'm not their attorney, David. When I'm just the quiet wife in the corner listening to them brag about their questionable business practices. You're bluffing. I smiled, picking up my knife and returning to my vegetables. Am I? Tell me, David, what exactly do you think I've been doing for the past 7 years while you've been building your real estate empire? What did you think I was working on in my little law practice? The silence stretched between us as I continued preparing dinner, the rhythmic sound of chopping filling the space where his confidence used to be. Elena, he said finally, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. Fear. What do you want? I set down the knife again, and turned to meet his eyes. What do I want, David? You filed for divorce this morning. You made it very clear what you want: your freedom, your assets, and your reputation as the victim of a manipulative wife. I'm simply going to make sure you get exactly what you asked for. What does that mean? It means that tomorrow some very interesting people are going to start learning some very interesting things about your friend. And since you've been so helpful in explaining to everyone that I'm a calculating, manipulative lawyer, no one will be surprised when the evidence I've been collecting finally sees the light of day. David stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, which in many ways You can't prove anything, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Can't I? I walked to my purse and pulled out a small digital recorder, one of several I'd been carrying to social events for years. Would you like to hear Jake Morrison explaining how his father's bank processes suspicious transactions, or maybe Tony Brennan describing how construction bids are predetermined? I have hours of material, David, years of it. That's a legal recording. In Massachusetts, only if there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. At public events, charity galas, and dinner parties where people are speaking loud enough for others to overhear, I shook my head. Perfectly legal, and perfectly damn. David sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Elena, you can't do this. These are our friends, our social circle. If you destroy them, our friends. I laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. David, these people have never been my friend. I've been a convenient accessory for 7 years, someone you could bring to events to look respectable while you and your real friends made your deals. The invisible wife who couldn't even manage to get pregnant. I never said. You said exactly that. This morning, and apparently many times before to many different people, I moved closer to him, close enough to see the sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the house. So here's what's going to happen, Dave. Tomorrow, the authorities are going to receive some very compelling evidence about financial crimes involving several prominent families in this city. The evidence will be thorough, documented, and completely admissible in court. Elena, please, the investigations that follow will probably take months, maybe years. During that time, your friends are going to be very busy dealing with federal prosecutors, grand juries, and the kind of media attention that destroys reputations permanently. I straightened up, smoothing my dress. And you, David, are going to discover that being married to the woman who provided that evidence might have been the only thing protecting you from being included in it. His eyes widened as the implications hit him. What do you mean? I mean that some of the most damning evidence I have involves your family's real estate business, transactions you've personally handled, deals you've personally negotiated, zoning violations you've personally covered up. You can't, but I haven't included any of that in what I'm turning over tomorrow, because technically some of it might fall under spousal privilege, as long as we're married. David stared at me as the full scope of his situation became clear. He'd thought he was divorcing a helpless woman who'd been dependent on him for 7 years. Instead, he was discovering that he'd been under surveillance by someone who'd been building a case that could destroy not just him but his entire social network. What do you want? He asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. What do I want? I smiled, thinking about his confident words that morning, his casual cruelty, his absolute certainty that he held all the power in our relationship. I want you to understand something, Dave. You were right about one thing. I am calculating. I have been manipulating this situation, but not the way you thought. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden where we'd hosted so many parties over the years, where his friends had felt comfortable enough to share their secrets with what they thought was a harmless audience. I didn't trap you with a pregnancy 7 years ago, Dave. I trapped you with something much more valuable and much more permanent. What? I turned back to face him, seeing in his expression the exact moment he realized that everything he thought he knew about our marriage, about me, about his own position in the world, was about to change forever. I trapped you with evidence, David. 7 years worth of evidence. And tomorrow, your friends are going to start learning exactly what that means. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of his breathing, and the tick of the antique clock on the wall, the clock his mother had given us as a wedding present, back when she thought I was just a sweet law student, who'd be grateful to marry into their family. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shatter more than just marriages, but tonight, I had dinner to finish and a husband who was finally beginning to understand exactly who he'd been living with for 7 years. As I returned to preparing our meal, I could feel David watching me with a mixture of fear and fascination, probably wondering how many other things he'd gotten completely wrong about the woman he thought he'd married. He was about to find out that the answer was everything. The next morning arrived with the precision of a chess master's opening gambit. I woke at 5:30 a.m., an hour before David's alarm, and made my way to the kitchen where everything had changed the night before. He'd barely touched his dinner, spending most of the evening staring at me as if trying to decode a puzzle he'd never realized existed. Sarah arrived at 6:45 a.m. with 3 boxes of meticulously organized files and 2 cups of coffee from the artisanal place downtown, the one David always complained was overpriced.
How much did she asked, glancing toward the stairs where David was presumably still processing yesterday's revelations. About as well as you'd expect, I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. He tried asking questions until midnight. I told him he'd get answers when his friends did. Sarah opened the first box, revealing years of carefully catalogued evidence. Each file was color-coded and cross-referenced, organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made my boutique law firm so successful with corporate clients who needed thorough, discreet representation. Detective Rodriguez is meeting us at 9 a.m., Sarah reported, checking her tablet. Federal Prosecutor Torres pushed his meeting to 11 a.m. Apparently the Morrison tip got his immediate attention, and Jennifer Walsh from the Globe cleared her entire afternoon. I nodded, reviewing the Morrison file one more time. Jake Morrison's banking irregularities were the perfect entry point, obvious enough to prompt immediate investigation, but connected to a network that would naturally draw scrutiny to the other family. David appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:15, looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive pajamas wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke to a night spent contemplating the complete restructuring of his reality. "Elena," he said quietly, "we need to talk." "Good morning, David. Coffee's fresh." I gestured to the pot without looking up from the Morrison financial records spread across our granite countertop. "Sarah, show him the Brennan construction file. I think he'll find the zoning violation documentation particularly interesting." Sarah pulled out a thick folder and placed it where David could see the tab, Brennan Industries, Municipal Corruption. His face went white as he recognized his own handwriting on several of the documents visible through the clear plastic sleeves. "Those are private business records," he said weakly. "Actually," I replied, finally looking up at him, "those are public records that became private business records through illegal manipulation. There's a difference, though I understand why you might be confused." David sank into the chair he'd occupied the night before, his eyes moving between the boxes of evidence and my face. "Elena, I don't understand. If you knew about all this, why didn't you say anything before? Why wait until now?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting. I set down my coffee and considered how much to reveal about my true motivations. "David, what do you think would have happened if I'd exposed this information 3 years ago, or 5 years ago?" What do you... "I mean that 3 years ago, you and your friends had enough influence to bury an investigation. Judge Delacroix could have influenced court proceedings. The Brennan family had enough city council connections to make evidence disappear. Your own family's real estate business generated enough tax revenue to keep politicians friendly." Sarah nodded approvingly as I continued, "But influence is a funny thing, David. It requires maintenance. It requires discretion, and it requires the people wielding it to be smart enough not to make enemies of the wrong people." "What's that supposed to mean?" I walked to the window, looking out at the garden where so many of these conversations had been overheard. "It means that your friends have spent the last 2 years making some very powerful enemies. The construction contracts Tony's family lost to legitimate bidders, the banking regulations that hurt the Morrison portfolio, the Judicial Review Board that's been scrutinizing federal appointments." David's confusion was evident, so I decided to spell it out for him.
"Your friends used to be untouchable because they were useful to the right people, but lately they've become liabilities. Tony's bid rigging scheme cost the city millions in overpriced contracts. Jake's banking irregularities triggered federal oversight that hurt other investors. Marcus's judicial influence peddling created precedents that embarrassed his father's colleagues. So now, instead of being the people who make problems disappear, they've become the problems that need to disappear. And when that happens, David, evidence that might have been suppressed before suddenly becomes very valuable to prosecutors looking to make careers." Sarah checked her watch. "Speaking of which, we should head out soon. Detective Rodriguez doesn't like to be kept waiting." David stood abruptly. "Elena, you can't do this. Whatever you think you know." "I don't think I know anything, David. I know exactly what I know, and I know exactly how to prove it." I moved closer to him, close enough to see the desperation in his eyes. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that you have choices to make, starting with whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem." He stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Elena, these are our friends. People we've known for years. People who've been to our dinner parties, our anniversary celebrations. People who've spent those dinner parties and anniversary celebrations discussing illegal activities in front of a lawyer they thought was too harmless to matter. I interrupted. People who've treated me like an invisible decoration while planning crimes in my living room. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, David. You served me divorce papers yesterday and told me that your friends deserve to know the truth about our marriage. Well, now they're going to learn some truths they weren't expecting. Sarah discreetly packed the Morrison files back into their box while David and I stared at each other across 7 years of misunderstood marriage. What if I withdrew the divorce papers? He asked suddenly. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. David, you can't unring a bell. You can't take back the things you've said about me to your friends. And you certainly can't undo the crimes they've committed. But if we stayed married, it might protect you from having to testify against me and vice versa. But it wouldn't protect your friends from the evidence I've already gathered. And it wouldn't protect you from being investigated as an accessory to their activity. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's efficient packing and the morning traffic beginning to build outside our windows. There is one option, I said finally. David's head snapped up with desperate hope. What? You could cooperate with the investigation, provide testimony about the activities you've witnessed, help prosecutors understand how these networks operate. You want me to betray my friends? I want you to tell the truth, David. The same truth you've been so eager to share about our marriage. I moved to the counter and poured myself another cup of coffee, taking my time to let him process the full scope of his situation. Here's what's going to happen today, I continued. I'm going to meet with law enforcement and provide them with evidence of extensive financial crime. That evidence will trigger investigations that will probably take months to fully unfold. Elena, during those investigations, your friends are going to be questioned about their activities. Their businesses will be scrutinized, their assets will be examined, and eventually prosecutors will want to know who else was involved in their operations. I turned back to face him. Now, David, you can be someone who helps them understand what happened, or you can be someone they investigate as a potential co-conspirator. The choice is yours. David slumped back into his chair, the fight going out of him as the full implications became clear. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've had 7 years to think about it, Dave. 7 years of being the invisible wife, listening to conversations I wasn't supposed to understand, watching activities I wasn't supposed to notice. Sarah appeared at my elbow with a final box of files. Elena, we should go. Traffic's getting heavy. I nodded, then looked back at David one more time. There's something else you should know. What? The story you've been telling about me trapping you with a fake pregnancy, about me being a manipulative liar who couldn't even manage to actually get pregnant. His face flushed as he remembered his words from the previous morning. You were right about the manipulation part, David. But you were wrong about the pregnancy part. What do you mean? I picked up my purse and the secure phone I'd been using to coordinate with law enforcement. I mean that there was never a pregnancy scare 7 years ago, fake or otherwise. There was just a young law student who'd discovered some very interesting information about your family's business practices and decided that marriage might be the best way to protect herself while she figured out what to do with that information. David's mouth fell open as he processed this revelation. So you see, I continued, you were absolutely correct about me being calculating and manipulative. You just had the timeline wrong. I didn't trap you with a pregnancy, David. I trapped you with evidence, and I've been collecting more of it ever since. I headed toward the door, Sarah following with her boxes of files. At the threshold I turned back one more time. Oh, and David, you might want to call your lawyer today. Not about the divorce, about criminal defense. Because when your friends find out who provided the evidence that destroys them, they're going to be very interested in discussing your role in all of this. The drive to police headquarters gave me time to review my strategy one more time. Detective Rodriguez had been building the Morrison banking case for 2 years, always just short of the evidence she needed to make charges stick. The financial records I'd accumulated would not only complete her case, but expand it to include the broader network of corruption that connected all of David's social circle. Sarah navigated Boston traffic with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years handling complex logistics for demanding clients. How do you think David will handle the pressure? Honestly, I think he'll crack within a week, I replied, reviewing my notes on Detective Rodriguez's previous cases. David's never faced real consequences for anything in his life. His family's money has always bought him out of trouble. When he realizes that money can't fix this situation, he'll look for the path of least resistance. And that path leads straight to his friends. Exactly. David's fundamentally a coward, Sarah. He'll sacrifice anyone to save himself, including the people he's called friends for 20 years. We pulled into the police headquarters parking garage at 8:55 a.m. Detective Rodriguez was waiting for us in the lobby, her expression professional but curious. Carmen Rodriguez had built her reputation on methodical investigation of white-collar crime, and she had a particular talent for turning financial evidence into compelling criminal cases. Mrs. Santos, she said, shaking my hand firmly, I have to admit, your call yesterday has kept me up most of the night. You mentioned evidence related to the Morrison banking investigation. Detective Rodriguez, what I have is going to do more than complete your Morrison case. It's going to open up investigations into at least 3 major crime families, and probably expose the largest municipal corruption network in Massachusetts history. Her eyes widened slightly, but her voice remained professional. That's quite a claim. I hope you have the evidence to back it up. Sarah stepped forward with the first box of files. Detective, what we have is 7 years of documented financial crimes, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence of activities that violate everything from banking regulations to federal racketeering statutes. For the next 2 hours, we laid out the scope of what I'd collected. Detective Rodriguez's professionalism gradually gave way to amazement as she realized the thoroughness of the documentation. Every questionable transaction had been traced, every suspicious conversation had been recorded, every violation had been cross-referenced with relevant statutes. Mrs. Santos, she said finally, I have to ask, how did you gain access to all of this information? I smiled, thinking of all the dinner parties where I'd been treated as invisible furniture while David's friends discussed their illegal activities with casual arrogance. Detective, I've been married to David Santos for 7 years. During that time, I've attended hundreds of social events where these men felt comfortable discussing their business activities in front of what they assumed was a harmless housewife who didn't understand finance or law. But you're an attorney. Yes, but they never bothered to ask what kind of law I practiced. They assumed that because I was quiet and supportive of my husband, I must be harmless. They were wrong. Detective Rodriguez flipped through the Morrison files, her expression growing more serious with each page. This isn't just evidence of banking irregularities. This is evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud federal regulatory agencies. That's just the Morrison family material, Sarah noted. The Delacroix and Brennan files contain similar levels of criminal activity and judicial corruption and municipal fraud. Why now? Detective Rodriguez asked. Why come forward with this information today? I considered how much personal detail to share with law enforcement. Detective, yesterday my husband served me with divorce papers. In the process, he made it clear that he's been telling people I'm a manipulative liar who trapped him into marriage. He's portrayed me as someone who's been deceiving him and taking advantage of him for 7 years. And he was absolutely right. I have been deceiving him. I have been manipulating the situation, but not in the way he thinks. I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. I've been building this case for 7 years. Every social event, every business dinner, every casual conversation has been an opportunity to gather evidence. David thinks I trapped him with lies about pregnancy. The truth is, I trapped him with his own criminal association. Detective Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Mrs. Santos, you realize that your husband could potentially be charged as an accessory to some of these crimes. I'm aware of that possibility, Detective. David will have to make his own choices about how to handle that situation. And you're prepared to testify against him if necessary. I thought about David's smug confidence as he'd served me divorce papers on Mother's Day, his casual cruelty in dismissing our marriage as a trap I'd set with lies. Detective, I'm prepared to testify to the truth about what I've observed and document. If that testimony implicates my husband in criminal activity, then David will have to face the consequences of his own actions. Sarah checked her watch discreetly. Detective, we have a meeting with Federal Prosecutor Torres in an hour. He's particularly interested in the interstate banking violations that connect to organized crime activities. Detective Rodriguez nodded. I'll need to coordinate with the federal investigation, obviously. This is bigger than anything our department can handle alone. Of course, but detective, I want you to know that I'm committed to seeing this through completely. Whatever resources you need, whatever testimony is required, whatever cooperation is necessary, I'm prepared to provide it. She studied my face carefully. Miss Santos, once this investigation begins, there's no going back. Your husband, his friends, their families, all of them are going to face serious legal consequences. Are you prepared for that level of disruption? I smiled, thinking of David's confident prediction that our divorce would be quick and simple, his assumption that I'd meekly accept whatever terms he offered. Detective Rodriguez, my husband spent yesterday morning explaining to me that I'm a calculating, manipulative woman who's been deceiving him for years. For once in our marriage, David was absolutely correct about something. The meeting with Federal Prosecutor Michael Torres was even more productive than the session with Detective Rodriguez. Torres had been building RICO cases against organized crime networks for 15 years, and he immediately recognized the value of having an inside source who'd been documenting activities for 7 years. Santos, he said, reviewing the financial records we'd provided, this level of documentation is extraordinary. Most of our cases depend on financial forensics and testimony from reluctant witnesses. What you've provided is real-time documentation of criminal conspiracy. I've been in a unique position to observe these activities, I replied. As the wife of someone in their social circle, I had access to conversations and events that would be impossible to infiltrate through traditional investigation. Torres nodded approvingly. The interstate banking violations alone would justify federal prosecution, but combined with the municipal corruption and the judicial influence peddling, we're looking at a comprehensive RICO case that could dismantle this entire network. Sarah leaned forward. Prosecutor Torres, Ms. Santos is prepared to provide testimony and cooperate fully with the investigation. She's also indicated that her husband might be willing to cooperate in exchange for consideration in his own potential prosecution. About that, Torres said, his expression becoming more serious. Ms. Santos, your husband's involvement in these activities could potentially be extensive. Some of the real estate transactions we've identified appear to directly involve money laundering through his family's business. I understand. Are you prepared for the possibility that your husband could face significant federal charges? I thought about David's arrogant certainty that he held all the power in our relationship, his casual dismissal of my intelligence and capabilities, his cruel timing in serving divorce papers on Mother's Day. Prosecutor Torres, my husband made a choice yesterday to end our marriage and publicly portray me as a manipulative liar. He's going to have to live with the consequences of that choice, just as he'll have to live with the consequences of his business activities. Torres nodded grimly. Miss Santos, I want you to understand something. When we move forward with this investigation, it's going to attract significant media attention. Your husband's friends come from very prominent families. There will be pressure to discredit you as a witness. What kind of pressure? They'll try to portray you as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge. They'll question your motives for coming forward now. They'll suggest that you're lying to hurt your husband. I smiled, thinking of how perfectly David had set up that narrative himself. Prosecutor Torres, my husband has already told everyone that I'm a manipulative liar who trapped him into marriage through deception. If his friends want to argue that I'm vindictive and dishonest, they'll just be confirming what David has already claimed about me. That's actually quite clever, Torres observed. By publicly portraying you as calculating and manipulative, your husband has inadvertently provided cover for your role as an intelligence gatherer. Exactly. No one will be surprised to learn that the manipulative wife was actually manipulating the situation all along. Torres closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Santos, I'm going to be honest with you. This case could take years to fully prosecute. Your life is going to be scrutinized by defense attorneys, media outlets, and federal investigators. Are you prepared for that level of exposure? I considered the question seriously. For 7 years I'd lived as the invisible wife, the harmless decoration who could be safely ignored while powerful men discussed their crimes. Tomorrow I would become the woman who brought down some of the most influential families in Massachusetts. Prosecutor Torres, yesterday my husband told me that his friends deserve to know the truth about our marriage. Today I'm going to make sure they learn more truth than they ever wanted to know. As we left the federal building, Sarah and I sat in her car for a moment, both of us processing the magnitude of what we'd just set in motion. No second thoughts? She asked quietly. I pulled out my phone and saw 17 missed calls from David, along with text messages that grew increasingly frantic as the morning had progressed. He'd obviously spent the hours while I was meeting with law enforcement trying to reach his friends, probably warning them about what was coming. Sarah, I said, do you know what David's biggest mistake was? Serving you divorce papers on Mother's Day? No, his biggest mistake was assuming that the quiet wife who listened to all his friends' secrets for 7 years was too harmless to do anything with that information. I started the car and headed back toward home, where David was undoubtedly waiting with questions I was finally ready to answer. Besides, I added, I told him the truth yesterday. I am exactly as calculating and manipulative as he always said I was. He just never bothered to figure out what I was calculating. As we drove through the city where David's friends had built their empires on corruption and influence, I felt the satisfaction of a chess player who'd been planning her endgame for 7 years. The first moves had been made. Now it was time to see how quickly the rest of the pieces would fall. Don't care what your lawyer says, Jake. Something's happening. Elena was gone all morning with boxes of files and she won't answer my calls. He spotted me in the doorway and abruptly ended the call. Elena, thank God, where have you been? Working, I replied simply, setting my purse down and observing his disheveled appearance. David's normally immaculate hair was tousled from running his hands through it. His expensive shirt was wrinkled and there were coffee stains on his silk tie. You look like you've had a productive day. Productive? His voice cracked slightly. Elena, I've been trying to reach you for hours. I called the office, I called Sarah. No one would tell me where you were. That's because I instructed them not to, I said, walking to the kitchen and pouring myself a glass of water. David, did you really think I was going to keep you informed about my schedule while you're divorcing me? He followed me, his movements agitated and desperate. Elena, we need to talk about yesterday, about what you said. About the evidence. What about it? Look, maybe I was hasty with the divorce papers. Maybe we can work things out. I turned to face him, studying his expression. The arrogant confidence from yesterday morning had been completely replaced by fear and calculation. David was scrambling, trying to find a way to control a situation that had already spiraled far beyond his influence. Work things out how? Exactly. We could go to counseling, take some time apart to think. Maybe postpone the divorce proceedings. David, I interrupted gently, what do you think has changed since yesterday morning? What do you mean? I mean that yesterday you were convinced I was a manipulative liar who had trapped you into marriage. You were eager to share that story with anyone who would listen. What's different today? His mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. Elena, you have to understand, I was angry. People say things when they're angry that they don't really mean. So you didn't mean it when you told your friends I trapped you with a fake pregnancy. It's complicated. It's not complicated at all, David. Either you believe I'm a manipulative liar, or you don't. Either you want a divorce, or you don't. Either you think your friends deserve to know the truth about me, or you don't. I moved closer to him, watching him struggle with the realization that his words had consequences he hadn't anticipated. Which is it, David? Before he could answer, his phone rang. Jake Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and David looked at me with desperate eyes before answering. Jake, what? David's face went white,
as he listened to whatever Jake was saying on the other end. What do you mean? Federal agents. When? No, I haven't heard anything. Elena, she's been gone all day. I don't know. I watched David's expression cycle through shock, fear and dawning comprehension, as Jake Morrison apparently shared some very interesting news about his morning. Okay, I'll call my lawyer. David ended the call and stared at me with a mixture of terror and awe. Federal agents visited Jake's bank this morning, he said quietly. They had a warrant for financial records going back 7 years. They also had recordings, David. Recordings of conversations Jake thought were private. How interesting, I replied, maintaining perfect calm while David's world crumbled around him. Elena, what did you do? I did exactly what I told you I was going to do, David. I provided law enforcement with evidence of criminal activity that I've been documenting for 7 years. His phone rang again. This time it was Tony Brennan, and I could hear Tony's voice even from across the kitchen, loud, panicked, and increasingly incoherent as he described his own visit from federal investigators. They knew about the Riverside Project, David said after ending the call, his voice hollow. They had documentation of the bid rigging, the zoning violations, everything. Tony said, they had photographs of meetings he thought were completely private. Were they private meetings, Dave? Or were they meetings where wives were present but ignored? The realization hit him like a physical blow. You were there, at the Riverside Project meeting. You were sitting in the corner with the other wives and you thought I was too stupid to understand what you were discussing. I finished for him. You thought that because I was quiet and supportive, I must be harmless. David's phone rang a third time. Marcus Delacroix's name appeared on the screen, and this time David looked at me before answering, as if asking permission. Answer it, I said. I'm curious to hear what Marcus has to say. David put the call on speaker, and Marcus's cultured voice filled our kitchen, though it was strained with barely controlled panic. David, please tell me you haven't heard from any federal investigators today. Not yet, David replied, his eyes never leaving my face. But Jake and Tony have both been contacted. Marcus, what's happening? What's happening is that someone has provided federal prosecutors with comprehensive evidence of activities that could destroy all of our families, Marcus said, his judicial training evident in his precise word choice even under stress. David, they had recordings of conversations from private events. They knew details about judicial decisions that were never supposed to be documented. What kind of recordings? The kind that could only have been made by someone with intimate access to our social circle. Someone who was present at family gatherings, charity events, private dinners. David's eyes widened as the full scope of his situation became clear. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What? Over the past few months, when I've been telling you guys about my marriage problems, about Elena being manipulative and deceptive, did any of you think to consider that maybe I was right about her being calculated? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Marcus responded, his voice grim. David, are you telling me that your wife, the woman we've all dismissed as harmless for 7 years, is the source of this investigation? I think that's exactly what I'm telling you. Dear God, Marcus whispered. David, do you have any idea how many sensitive conversations she's been present for? How many family gatherings? How many business discussions? All of them, Marcus. She's been to all of them. I listened to this conversation with the satisfaction of someone whose strategy was unfolding exactly as planned. For 7 years, these men had treated me as invisible furniture while discussing criminal activities in my presence. Now they were beginning to understand that furniture sometimes has ears. David, Marcus said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd learned from his federal judge father, you need to distance yourself from this situation immediately. Retain criminal defense counsel. Do not discuss this matter with anyone else, including Elena. It's a bit late for that advice, Marcus, I said, speaking directly into the phone. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena, Marcus said finally, his voice carefully controlled. I didn't realize you were listening. I've been listening for 7 years, Marcus. The question is whether you've been paying attention to what you've been saying. Elena, I think there may be some misunderstanding about, there's no misunderstanding, Mark. I have recordings of you discussing how to influence your father's judicial decisions. I have documentation of payments made to ensure favorable rulings. I have photographs of meetings where you coordinated with other families to manipulate the federal court system. Another long silence before Marcus spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? It was the same question David had asked the night before, and it revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. I don't want anything from you, Marcus. I wanted justice for the people your corruption has harmed over the years. I wanted accountability for the crimes you've committed with impunity. I wanted consequences for the arrogance that led you to discuss illegal activities in front of someone you considered too harmless to matter. Elena, Marcus said, shifting to a more conciliatory tone, surely we can come to some kind of arrangement. The arrangement has already been made, Marcus, with federal prosecutors who were very interested in the evidence I provided this morning. I ended the call and looked at David, who was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. How long? He asked quietly. How long what? How long have you been planning this? I considered the question carefully. David, I started documenting questionable activities about 3 years into our marriage, when I realized that your friends were using our social gatherings to coordinate criminal enterprises, but I wasn't planning to use that information until yesterday morning. What changed? You changed the rules of engagement, David. When you decided to publicly portray me as a manipulative liar, you gave me the perfect cover for being exactly that. His phone buzzed with a text message, then another, then a flood of them as his social circle began to panic and coordinate their response to the federal investigation. They're all texting, David said, scrolling through the messages. They want to meet tonight. Emergency gathering at Tony's house. Are you going? David looked at me uncertainly. Should I? That depends, David. Are you planning to warn them about what's coming? Are you going to help them coordinate their defense? Are you going to assist them in obstructing a federal investigation? I know, of course not. Then what would be the purpose of attending? David sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs, his phone still buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from his friends. Elena, I need you to understand something. These people aren't just my friends, they're my business partner. The Morrison Bank handles our real estate financing. The Brennan Construction Company works on our development projects. Marcus has helped us navigate legal challenges for years. I understand the business relationships, David. If they go down, our family business goes down with them. My father's life work, everything he built, it could all be destroyed. I studied his face, seeing genuine anguish for the first time since this conversation began. David, are you asking me to withdraw the evidence I've provided to federal prosecutors?
I'm asking you to consider the collateral damage. My parents, my sister, the employees who work for our company, they're all innocent people who could be hurt by this. It was a fair point, and one I'd considered extensively over the years as I documented the criminal activities of David's social circle. David, do you remember the Riverside housing project that Tony's company built 3 years ago? Of course. It was a major development. Do you remember the family that was displaced when the city condemned their property to make way for that development? David's expression became uncertain. Vaguely, there were some eminent domain issues. The Castellanos family. They'd owned their home for 30 years. The city condemned it based on false environmental reports that Tony's company provided. They were paid a fraction of what the property was worth. And the environmental concerns mysteriously disappeared after the condemnation was finalized. Elena, that's just business. The Castellanos family lost their home. David, Mrs. Castellanos lost her garden where she'd grown vegetables for 3 decades. Their teenage son had to change school. They were forced to move to a neighborhood where their daughter was the victim of a violent crime. 6 months later. David was quiet, probably not remembering the details of people he'd never considered important enough to notice. That's just one family affected by one project, David. Over the past 7 years, I've documented dozens of similar cases. Families displaced by fraudulent condemnation proceedings. Small businesses destroyed by rigged bidding processes. people denied justice because of judicial corruption. I moved closer to him, making sure he could see the conviction in my eyes. You're asking me to consider the collateral damage to your family and friends. I'm asking you to consider the collateral damage they've been inflicting on innocent people for years. David's phone rang again, but this time he looked at the screen and declined the call without answering. What happens now? He asked. Now you make choices, David. You can cooperate with the federal investigation and provide testimony about the criminal activities you've witnessed. You can accept responsibility for your own involvement in those activities. You can help prosecutors understand how these networks operate so they can prevent similar crimes in the future. Or you can try to protect your friends and business partners, obstruct the investigation and face federal conspiracy charges alongside them. David was quiet for a long moment, processing the stark nature of his options. Elena, if I cooperate with the investigation, if I testify against Marcus and Tony and Jake, I'll be destroying people I've known since college. David, those people destroyed themselves when they chose to commit crimes. You're not responsible for their choices. But I am responsible for mine. It was the first time in our 7-year marriage that I'd heard David acknowledge personal responsibility for anything. And it gave me a glimmer of hope that maybe he was capable of growth after all. Yes, you are responsible for your choices. The question is what choices you're going to make going forward. His phone buzzed with another text message, this one apparently from his father asking about rumors of federal investigations into their business partners. My family's going to find out about all of this, David said quietly. Yes, they are. They're going to find out that my wife, that you are the source of the investigation that could destroy everything they've worked for. They're going to find out that their business was built on partnerships with criminals. Whether they blame me for exposing that or blame themselves for allowing it is up to them. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where so many of the incriminating conversations had taken place. You really have been planning this for years, haven't you? I've been documenting criminal activity for years, David. I only decided to use that documentation yesterday morning when you made it clear that you consider me a manipulative liar who trapped you into marriage. And now you're proving that I was right about you being manipulative. I smiled, thinking about how perfectly David had set up his own destruction with his arrogant assumptions about my character. Yes, David, you were absolutely right about me being calculating and manipulative. You just never bothered to figure out what I was manipulating toward. He turned back to face me, his expression a mixture of fear, admiration, and something that might have been respect. Elena, I have to ask, did you ever love me, or was this all just an elaborate long-term investigation? It was a question I'd been expecting and one I'd been dreading. The truth was more complicated than David's simple categories allowed for. David, I married you because I needed to protect myself from the consequences of information I'd discovered about your family's business activity. But I stayed married to you because I hoped that maybe over time we could build something real together. And now I know that you're the kind of man who serves his wife divorce papers on Mother's Day and tells his friends that she trapped him with lies about pregnancy. So no, David, I don't love you anymore, but I did love you once back when I thought you might be capable of being better than your friend. The kitchen fell silent except for the constant buzzing of David's phone as his social circle continued to panic and coordinate their response to the federal investigation that was about to destroy their carefully constructed world of privilege and corruption. What happens to us? David asked finally. That depends on the choices you make over the next few days. David, if you cooperate with the investigation and take responsibility for your actions, maybe we can find a way to end our marriage with dignity. If you try to protect your criminal friends and obstruct justice, then you'll face the consequences alone. David's phone rang one more time, and this time he looked at the screen and made a decision. Instead of answering, he powered it off completely and looked at me with something approaching resolve. Elena, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be completely honest. What? If I cooperate with this investigation, if I testify truthfully about what I've seen and done, is there any chance that we could somehow work through this? that maybe we could find a way to save our marriage. I studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance and entitlement that had characterized our relationship for so long. Instead, I saw something I'd rarely seen in David. Genuine humility. David, you served me divorce papers yesterday morning and told me that I was a manipulative liar who had trapped you into marriage. Do you really think we can come back from that? I don't know. But I think I'd like to try. It was an interesting development, but one that didn't change the fundamental trajectory of events that were already in motion. David, federal prosecutors don't care about our marriage problems, they care about building cases against criminal enterprise, whether we stay married or get divorced. The investigation is going to proceed. I understand that, but Elena, if I'm going to lose everything else, my friends, my business relationships, probably my freedom, I'd like to know if there's any possibility of not losing you too. I looked at David and saw, perhaps for the first time, the man I'd hoped he might become when I'd married him 7 years ago. It was too late for our marriage, but maybe it wasn't too late for him to become someone better than he'd been. David, if you cooperate fully with the investigation, if you take responsibility for your actions, if you help prosecutors understand how these criminal networks operate, then maybe we can find a way to end our marriage as friends instead of enemies. That's not exactly what I was hoping for. It's more than you deserved after yesterday morning, David. He nodded slowly, accepting the reality of consequences that were finally catching up to him after 7 years of thinking he was untouchable. Okay, he said finally. Okay, I'll cooperate with the investigation. Good. That's the first smart decision you've made since you decided to marry me. As David began the process of accepting responsibility for his choices, I reflected on the fact that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone, it's forcing them to become better than they ever thought they could be. The investigation would proceed, the criminal network would be dismantled, and David would have to live with the consequences of his actions. But for the first time in 7 years, I had reason to hope that those consequences might actually teach him something valuable about the difference between influence and integrity. The next morning brought an unexpected development. David was already awake when I came downstairs at 6 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting. "You're up early," I observed, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the discarded tissues that suggested he'd been crying at some point during the night. "I didn't sleep," he replied without looking up from his note. "I've been trying to write down everything I can remember about the activities you've been documenting. Dates, conversations, financial transactions, all of it." I poured myself coffee and sat across from him, studying the pages of cramped handwriting that covered his legal pad. David's usual confident scrawl had been replaced by careful, methodical notes that suggested hours of careful thought. "This is quite thorough," I said, scanning the visible portions of his list: the Riverside Project, the Morrison banking irregularities, the Delacroix judicial interventions. "You've been paying more attention than I realized. Elena, I need you to understand something. Last night after our conversation, I started thinking about all the times you were present during business discussions, all the times we treated you like you were invisible while we talked about things we shouldn't have been talking about." He flipped to a new page, revealing another set of detailed notes. "I remembered the Castellanos family you mentioned yesterday. And then I started remembering other families, other people who were hurt by the things we did, people I never bothered to think about because they weren't important to our business interests." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic positioning. Instead, I saw something I'd rarely witnessed in David: genuine remorse. "What changed your mind?" "I called my father last night." This was unexpected. David's relationship with his father was complicated, respectful but distant, built on shared business interests rather than emotional connection. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that federal investigators were looking into our business partnerships, and that there was evidence of criminal activity involving our associates. I told him that you were cooperating with the investigation." "How did he respond?" David was quiet for a moment, staring at his coffee cup. "He asked me if the allegations were true, if Marcus and Tony and Jake had really been committing the crimes you documented. And I couldn't lie to him, Elena. I told him yes, They were all guilty of everything you'd record. And then he asked me the question that kept me awake all night. Which was, he asked me if I was guilty too. David finally looked up at me and I saw in his eyes the weight of a lifetime of assumptions being systematically dismantled. Elena, my father built our business over 40 years. He started with nothing and created something he could be proud of, something he could pass down to his children. And I've spent the last 7 years compromising everything he worked for by associating with criminals. David, no, let me finish. My father asked me if I was guilty, and I realized that I couldn't answer that question without understanding exactly what I was guilty of. So I spent the night going through everything I could remember, trying to document my own involvement in activities that violated his principles and the law. He handed me the legal pad, and I flipped through pages of detailed confessions. David had documented his role in zoning violations, bid rigging schemes, money laundering transactions, and judicial influence peddling with the thoroughness of someone seeking absolution through complete honesty. This is quite comprehensive, I said, impressed despite myself with his attention to detail. Elena, I want to cooperate with the federal investigation, not because I'm trying to save myself from prosecution, but because I need to understand the full scope of what I've done wrong so I can figure out how to make it right. Before I could respond, my secure phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. Elena, we have developments, Sarah said without preamble. Detective Rodriguez called 20 minutes ago. The Morrison banking investigation triggered a multi-agency task force overnight. FBI, IRS, Treasury Department. They're all involved now. What does that mean practically? It means that by this afternoon, there will be simultaneous raids on Morrison Banking, Brennan Industries, and the Delacroix family law offices. Federal agents will be seizing records, computers, and financial documents going back a decade. I looked at David, who was listening intently to our conversation. Sarah, David has prepared a detailed written statement, documenting his knowledge of criminal activities. He wants to cooperate fully with the investigation. That's unexpected. How detailed? Very detailed. Names, dates, financial amounts, specific violations, everything. Elena, that could be extremely valuable to prosecutors. It might also put David in significant personal danger if his friends realize he's cooperating. David leaned forward. Sarah, this is David. I understand the risks, but I've made my decision. I want to do the right thing, regardless of the personal consequences. There was a pause before Sarah responded. David, I hope you understand that cooperating with a federal investigation isn't something you can change your mind about later. Once you provide testimony, you're committed to seeing this through completely. I understand. Okay, Elena, Prosecutor Torres wants to meet with both of you this afternoon. He's particularly interested in David's knowledge of the financial structures underlying these criminal enterprises. After ending the call with Sarah, David and I sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what was about to unfold. David, I said finally, are you certain about this decision? Once you meet with federal prosecutors, there's no going back. Your friends will never forgive you for cooperating. Elena, my friends were never really my friends. They were business associates who happened to be criminals. I've spent 7 years confusing networking with friendship, and it's cost me everything that actually mattered. What do you mean? I mean that I chose their approval over your respect. I chose their criminal schemes over legitimate business practices. I chose their version of success over my father's principles. He gestured to his legal pad. And I chose their narrative about our marriage over the truth about who you really are. It was the most self-aware statement I'd ever heard David make, and it gave me hope that maybe his cooperation with the investigation was motivated by genuine growth rather than strategic self-preservation. David, you realize that testifying against your friends won't undo the damage that's already been done, to their victims, to your father's business, to our marriage. I know that, but Elena, I can't undo the past 7 years. I can only try to make better choices going forward. My regular phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed Marcus Delacroix's number, and David and I looked at each other uncertainly. Answer it, I said. Let's hear what Marcus has to say. David put the call on speaker, and Marcus's voice filled our kitchen, though it sounded strained and desperate compared to his usual judicial authority. David, thank God, we've been trying to reach you all night. We need to meet immediately. Marcus, I can't. David, listen to me. We have a serious problem. Jake's lawyer thinks the federal investigation is based on inside information that could only have come from someone with intimate access to our activities. Marcus, we think it's Elena. David, we think your wife has been working with federal investigators for months, maybe years. We need to discuss how to handle this situation. David looked at me, and I nodded encouragingly. Marcus, Elena isn't working with federal investigators. What do you mean? I mean that Elena is the federal investigation. She's been documenting our criminal activities for 7 years, and yesterday she provided comprehensive evidence to prosecutors. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I wondered if Marcus had hung up. David, Marcus said finally, his voice barely controlled. Please tell me you're joking. I'm not joking, Marcus. Elena has recordings of our conversations, photographs of our meetings, documentation of our financial transactions, everything, and she's turned it all over to federal prosecutors. David, do you understand what you're saying? Do you understand what this means? It means that we're all going to face the consequences of our actions. No, David. It means that your wife has destroyed all of our families out of spite because you filed for divorce. I leaned toward the phone. Marcus, this is Elaine. I provided evidence to federal prosecutors because your criminal activities have harmed innocent people for years, not because David filed for divorce. Elena, surely we can reach some kind of arrangement. The only arrangement has already been made, Marcus, with prosecutors who are very interested in justice for the people you've victimized. Elena, you don't understand the broader implications of what you've done, the economic impact, the political ramifications. I understand that you've been using your father's judicial position to influence federal court decisions for personal profit. Marcus, I understand that you've been taking payments to ensure favorable rulings in cases involving millions of dollars. That's not what I have. Recordings, Marcus. I have bank records. I have photographs of meetings where payments were exchanged for judicial influence. I have 7 years of comprehensive documentation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before responding, his voice taking on a different tone, colder, more threatening. Elena, you realize that what you've done could be considered extortion, blackmail. You collected this information while pretending to be a supportive wife, then used it to destroy people who trusted you. David spoke before I could respond. Marcus, Elena collected evidence of criminal activities that we were stupid enough to discuss in front of her. We trusted her because we assumed she was too harmless to matter. We were wrong. David, you can't seriously be defending her actions. I'm not defending her actions, Marcus. I'm acknowledging that our actions created the situation she documented. David, listen to me very carefully. If you cooperate with this investigation, if you provide testimony against us, you'll be destroying relationships that go back 20 years. You'll be betraying people who've helped your family build their business. Marcus, you helped my family build our business by providing us with access to criminal enterprises. That's not help. That's corruption. I watched David's face as he spoke, seeing the conviction in his voice that suggested his decision to cooperate was based on principle rather than strategy. David, Marcus said, his voice becoming more desperate. Think about your parents. Think about your sister. Think about the employees who work for your family's company. If you testify against us, the resulting investigations could destroy everything your father built. It was a compelling argument, and I could see David struggling with the implications. Marcus, if my father's business is built on criminal associations, then maybe it needs to be destroyed. David, you can't mean that. I mean that I've spent the last 7 years compromising my father's principles to maintain relationships with people who were using me to legitimize their criminal activities. I'm not going to continue making that mistake. Marcus was quiet for several seconds before speaking again, his tone shifting to something more calculating. David, I want you to think very carefully about what you're saying. If you cooperate with this investigation, you're going to face the same criminal charges we. Elena,
may think she's protecting you by staying married to you, but spousal privilege won't protect you from prosecution as an accessory to our activities. I understand that, Marcus. David, you personally handled real estate transactions that laundered money for organized crime families. You personally violated zoning laws to facilitate construction projects. You personally benefited from judicial corruption. David looked at me, and I saw in his eyes that he understood the full scope of his legal exposure. Marcus, I'm going to take responsibility for my actions. David, taking responsibility means accepting that you could spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Then that's what I'll accept. The conviction in David's voice surprised me. This was not the entitled, arrogant man who had served me divorce papers 2 days ago. This was someone who had undergone a fundamental transformation in his understanding of accountability and consequence. David, Marcus said, making one final attempt, Elena has destroyed all of our lives to get revenge for your divorce. Don't let her destroy yours too, Marcus. Elena didn't destroy our lives. We destroyed our own lives by committing crimes. Elena just documented what we were doing. David, Marcus, I'm going to hang up now. I'm going to meet with federal prosecutors this afternoon, and I'm going to tell them everything I know about the criminal activities we've all been involved in. David, if you do this, you'll never be welcome in our social circle again. David smiled grimly. Marcus, your social circle is about to be dismantled by federal prosecutors. I don't think that's going to be a problem. He ended the call and turned to face me with an expression I'd never seen before, peaceful, resolved, and completely free of the arrogance that had characterized our relationship for 7 years. Elena, I have one more question for you. What's that? When you were documenting all of this criminal activity, did you ever consider warning us, giving us a chance to stop before we went too far? I thought about the question seriously. It was one I'd asked myself many times over the years, as I'd watched David and his friends dig themselves deeper into criminal activity. David, would you have listened if I'd warned you? Honestly, probably not. Would you have taken me seriously if I'd tried to explain that your business activities were criminal? Probably not. Would you have believed me if I'd told you that your friends were using you to launder money and influence judicial decisions? David was quiet for a moment, considering the question. No, he said finally. I would have thought you were being paranoid or jealous, or trying to sabotage my business relationships. Then you understand why I chose to document rather than warn. I understand that you were protecting yourself from people who wouldn't have listened to you anyway. It was the most accurate assessment of my motivations that David had ever made, and it suggested that he was finally beginning to understand the true dynamics of our relationship. David, there's something else you should know. What? The reason I was able to document all of this criminal activity so thoroughly is that I've been working as a federal informant for the past 3 years. David's eyes widened as this new information hit him. Elena, what do you mean? I mean that 3 years ago, I contacted the FBI and offered to provide information about the criminal activities I was observing. I've been working with federal investigators ever since, providing real-time intelligence about organized crime operations. You've been a federal informant for 3 years. Yes. While we were married. Yes. David stared at me as he processed this revelation, probably wondering how many other fundamental assumptions about our relationship were completely wrong. Elena, that means that every conversation I've had with you for the past 3 years, every piece of information I've shared with you about business activities, all of it was being reported to federal investigators. Yes, David, all of it. He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the full scope of how thoroughly he'd been under surveillance by his own wife. Elena, I have to ask, was any part of our marriage real, or was I just a target in a federal investigation the entire time? It was the question I'd been dreading, and the one I owed him an honest answer to. David, I married you to protect myself from the consequences of information I'd discovered about criminal activities, but for the first few years, I hoped that maybe we could build something genuine together. And then, I realized that you were never going to be the man I hoped you could be. You were too comfortable with corruption, too entitled to acknowledge consequences, too arrogant to consider that your actions might hurt innocent people. So you decided to destroy me. I decided to fulfill my obligation as a federal informant to report criminal activities I was observing. The fact that those activities involved my husband was unfortunate, but it didn't change my responsibility to report them. David nodded slowly, accepting the reality of a marriage that had been far more complicated than he'd ever realized. Elena, when I meet with federal prosecutors this afternoon, am I going to discover that I'm not just a witness in this investigation? David, you're going to discover that you're whatever your actions over the past 7 years have made you. If you've committed crimes, you'll face the consequences. If you've been an accessory to crimes, you'll face those consequences too. And if I cooperate fully with the investigation, then maybe you'll face those consequences with some measure of dignity and the possibility of redemption. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where so many of the incriminating conversations had taken place. Elena, I want you to know that I understand now why you did what you did. I don't like it, and I wish things could have been different, but I understand it. Thank you. And I want you to know that when I meet with prosecutors this afternoon, I'm going to tell them everything, not because I'm trying to minimize my own legal exposure, but because I finally understand that the truth is more important than protecting people who never deserved protection. It was the first time in our 7-year marriage that David had chosen principle over self-interest, and it gave me hope that maybe the destruction of his criminal network would ultimately lead to the construction of something better. David, there's one more thing I need to tell you. What's that? Yesterday morning, when you served me divorce papers, and told me that I was a manipulative liar who had trapped you into marriage, you were absolutely right. Elena, you were right about me being calculating and manipulative. You were right about me having ulterior motives for our marriage. You were right about me deceiving you for years. Elena, I understand that now, but David, you were wrong about one thing. What? You thought I trapped you, but the truth is, you trapped yourself. Every criminal conversation you participated in, every illegal transaction you facilitated, every corrupt relationship you maintained, those were choices you made. I just documented them. David turned back to face me and I saw in his expression the acceptance of responsibility that had been absent from our entire relationship until now. Elena, you're right. I trapped myself, and now I'm going to face the consequences of that trap. As we prepared to meet with federal prosecutors, I reflected on the fact that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone's life, it's forcing them to finally understand the life they've been living. David was about to face justice for his crimes, but he was also about to discover who he could become when he stopped running from the truth about himself.
6 months later, I stood in the same federal courthouse where it all began, watching as the last of David's former friends received their sentences. Marcus Delacroix, 15 years for judicial corruption and racketeering. Tony Brennan, 12 years for money laundering and bid rigging. Jake Morrison, 18 years for operating a criminal enterprise through his family's bank. The Morrison banking investigation had uncovered a money laundering operation that processed over $200 million for organized crime families. The Brennan construction fraud had cost the city nearly $50 million in inflated contracts. The Delacroix judicial corruption had affected hundreds of court cases over a decade. Miss Santos, Prosecutor Torres, said, approaching me in the courthouse hallway, I wanted to personally thank you for your courage in seeing this through. Your testimony was instrumental in securing these convictions. Thank you, Prosecutor Torres. I'm just glad that justice was finally served for all the people they victimized. David emerged from the courtroom where he'd just finished his final day of testimony. His cooperation with federal investigators had been complete and unwavering, helping prosecutors understand the full scope of the criminal network. How did it go? I asked. The judge accepted my plea agreement, he replied quietly. 2 years in federal prison, 3 years probation, and full restitution to the victims of projects I was involved in. It was a fair sentence considering his cooperation and genuine remorse. David had not only testified against his former friends, but had also provided evidence that led to the discovery of additional crimes and victims. David, I want you to know that I'm proud of the choices you made during this investigation. He looked surprised. Elena, I destroyed our marriage and got involved in criminal activities that hurt innocent people. I'm not sure pride is the appropriate response. You could have tried to protect your friends and minimize your own involvement. Instead, you chose to tell the truth and help prosecutors understand how these crimes affected real people. That took courage. We walked outside together, past the media crews that had covered the trial for months. The story had become a sensation. The quiet wife who brought down Boston's most powerful corruption ring. The husband who chose redemption over loyalty to criminal friends. Alina, David said as we reached the courthouse steps. I have something for you. He handed me a manila envelope, and I opened it to find our divorce papers. The same ones he'd served me on Mother's Day 6 months ago. I'm withdrawing the divorce petition, he said quietly. David, not because I think we can save our marriage. I know that's not possible after everything that's happened, but because I don't want our marriage to end with the cruelty I showed you that morning. I studied his face, seeing the genuine transformation that had occurred over the past 6 months. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we end our marriage the way we should have ended it years ago, with honesty, respect, and acknowledgement of what we both contributed to its failure. It was a gesture I hadn't expected, but one that demonstrated how much David had changed during the investigation. I accept your proposal, I said, but I have one condition. What's that? When you're released from prison, I want you to consider working with victim advocacy groups. Your experience understanding both sides of white-collar crime could help other people avoid becoming victims of similar schemes. David smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. Alina, I think that's exactly the kind of work I should be doing. 6 months later, I stood in a different courtroom, this time for our uncontested divorce proceedings. David was serving his sentence at a minimum security federal facility, where he was already working with a program that helped inmates understand the impact of financial crimes on victims. The divorce was finalized quickly and amicably. David had signed over his share of our assets to a victim compensation fund, keeping only enough to restart his life when he was released. I retained our house, which I'd converted into offices for an expanded law practice, specializing in helping victims of white-collar crime. After the proceedings, I sat in my car and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 7 years of marriage to a man who never truly knew me. 3 years as a federal informant, documenting criminal activities. 6 months of trials and testimony that resulted in justice for hundreds of victims. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Jennifer Walsh at the Globe wants to interview you about the victim advocacy work. Still interested? I typed back. Set it up. It's time to tell the whole story. The interview would be my first public discussion of the investigation, and its aftermath. I plan to focus not on the revenge aspect of the story, but on the importance of accountability and the courage required to speak up about corruption. As I drove home, I passed the neighborhood where the Castellanos family had been displaced by Tony Brennan's fraudulent development project. The family had received full compensation as part of the restitution settlement, and Mrs. Castellanos had been able to replant her garden in their new home. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call. Mrs. Santos, this is Maria Castellanos. I wanted to thank you for what you did. Miss Castellanos, how did you get my number? The victim's advocate gave it to me. She said you were the person who made sure we got justice for what happened to our family. I'm just glad that you received the compensation you deserved. Mrs. Santos, my daughter wanted me to tell you something. She said that when bad people hurt innocent families, sometimes good people have to be brave enough to stop them. She thinks you're a hero. After ending the call, I sat in my home office, the same room where I'd planned my strategy 7 years ago. The hidden panel that had concealed my evidence files was now open, converted into a display case for awards I'd received from victim advocacy organizations. My phone rang one more time. David's name appeared on the screen, his weekly call from federal prison. Alina, how are you? I'm well, David. How's the victim advocacy program going? It's challenging but rewarding. Working with other inmates to help them understand the real impact of financial crimes has given me perspective I never had before. I'm glad to hear. Alina, I want you to know that I finally understand what you meant when you said I trapped myself. Every choice I made, every criminal activity I participated in, every time I chose convenience over conscience, those were my decisions. Yes, they were, but I also want you to know that I'm grateful that you documented those choices. If you hadn't, I never would have faced the consequences that forced me to become a better person. It was the most self-aware statement David had ever made, and it confirmed that his transformation was genuine. David, you chose to become a better person. I just provided the circumstances that made that choice necessary. Alina, do you think that someday when I've served my sentence and completed my probation, we might be able to be friends? I considered the question carefully. The man I'd married 7 years ago had been arrogant, entitled and willfully blind to the consequences of his actions. The man I was speaking to now had accepted responsibility, sought redemption, and committed himself to helping others avoid similar mistakes. David, I think that when you're released you'll be someone I'd be honored to call a friend. 3 years later, I attended David's graduation from a victim advocacy training program. He'd completed his sentence, finished his probation, and dedicated himself to helping families affected by white-collar crime. After the ceremony, we had coffee together, the first time we'd sat across from each other without lawyers, federal agents or prison guards present. Alina, I want you to know that everything I am now, everything positive I've built since prison, exists because you had the courage to document the truth about who I was then. David, you built this new life through your own choices and hard work, but those choices were only possible because you forced me to confront the consequences of my previous choices. I smiled, thinking about how far we'd both traveled from that Mother's Day morning, when he'd served me divorce papers with such confident cruelty. David, do you want to know something I never told you? What's that? That morning, when you served me divorce papers and told me I was a manipulative liar who had trapped you, you were absolutely right. Alina, I was manipulative. I was calculating. I had been deceiving you for years. But David, the trap I set wasn't for you. It was for the criminals you'd chosen to associate with. You just happened to get caught in it, because you'd chosen to become one of them. David nodded slowly, understanding the distinction I was making. Alina, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Of course. Do you regret any of it? The investigation, the destruction of our marriage, the years of living with someone whose true character you despise. I thought about the hundreds of victims who had received justice and compensation. I thought about the criminal enterprises that had been dismantled. I thought about the deterrent effect that had prevented similar crimes by other corrupt networks. David, I regret that it took 7 years to bring those criminals to justice. I regret that innocent people suffered while I was building the case. I regret that you got so deeply involved in criminal activities that you had to go to prison to learn how to be honest. But do you regret exposing the truth? No, David. I've never regretted ensuring that people who committed crimes finally faced consequences for their actions, even though it destroyed our marriage. David, our marriage was destroyed the moment you chose to value criminal associations over integrity. I just documented the destruction. I didn't cause it. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had traveled very different paths to reach the same understanding about truth, consequences, and redemption. Alina, David said finally, I want you to know that serving you those divorce papers on Mother's Day was the biggest mistake I ever made. Why? Because if I hadn't done that, you might never have decided to expose the criminal network, and I might never have been forced to confront who I'd become. I might have continued being someone I'm ashamed of for the rest of my life. I smiled, thinking about the irony of David's gratitude for what he'd once seen as my betrayal. David, you were right about one thing that morning. What's that? You said your friends deserved to know the truth. They did deserve to know the truth about crime, consequences, and the price of corruption, and they learned it. Yes, they did, the hard way. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, David handed me a card. What's that? It's an invitation to the opening of the Victim Advocacy Center I'm starting next month. It's funded entirely by restitution payments from cases I helped prosecute. I read the invitation, noting that the center would provide free legal and financial counseling to families affected by white-collar crime. David, this is wonderful. I'm honored to be invited. Alina, I want you to know that everything good I do for the rest of my life is part of making amends for the crimes I committed and the harm I caused. David, you don't owe me amends, you owe them to the people who were victimized by the criminal activities you participated in. I know, and I plan to spend the rest of my life earning their forgiveness through service to others in similar situations. 6 months later, I attended the opening of David's Victim Advocacy Center. The event was covered by the same journalist who had reported on the corruption trials, but this time the story was about redemption rather than retribution. During the opening ceremony, David spoke to an audience of former victims, legal professionals and community advocates. 7 years ago I was part of a criminal network that hurt innocent families for financial gain. I thought I was successful, but I was actually just a well-dressed criminal who had learned to rationalize my crimes. He paused, looking at the audience with complete honesty. The person who exposed my crimes was someone I'd dismissed as harmless, my wife, who had been documenting our criminal activities for years while I thought she was just being supportive. Murmur went through the audience as people recognized the story from the extensive media coverage. Today, I want to thank that person for having the courage to ensure that criminals face consequences for their actions, even when one of those criminals was someone she'd once loved. In the audience, I felt the satisfaction that comes not from revenge, but from justice. David had indeed been trapped, but he'd trapped himself through his own choices. I just provided the documentation that forced him to face the consequences of those choices. As I left the event, I reflected on a simple truth. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone's life, it's forcing them to build a better one. The man who had served me divorce papers on Mother's Day, claiming I'd trapped him with lies, had finally learned that the only person who had trapped him was himself, and in learning that lesson, he'd become someone worth knowing. The trap I'd set had caught exactly the right person, the criminal David had chosen to become, but it had also freed someone I'd never expected to meet. The man David was capable of being when he chose integrity over convenience. Sometimes revenge evolves into something more valuable, the opportunity for everyone involved to discover who they really are when they stop running from the truth about themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.